The trimmer's blade screeched against bone, my ancestor's bone. The violet flame flickered as the cultists' masks loomed in the pantry, their knives glinting. I swung the brass candlestick, my arms burning, but the journal in my pocket burned worse. The wax wasn't wax. The debt wasn't money. And the man who delivered my supplies, he knew. The candle's light pulsed like a heartbeat. My heartbeat. The walls whispered with names I recognized. Thorne, Thorne, Thorne. The first cut had already been made. The rest were coming. Steel teeth ground through the thick, waxy wick. Elias Thorne gripped the industrial trimmers, his knuckles white against the blackened metal. The violet flame hissed, casting long, bruised shadows across the damp limestone walls of the labyrinth. He squinted against the ultraviolet glare, the scent of ozone and rotting jasmine stinging his nostrils. This ritual demanded precision. A fraction of an inch too short, and the labyrinth would begin its slow, grinding reconfiguration. He wiped sweat from his brow with a grease-stained sleeve, the salt stinging a small cut on his thumb. On the stone pedestal beside him, a hand-drawn map fluttered in the draft. His charcoal lines depicted a sub-basement that refused to remain static. Elias traced a jagged corridor with a trembling finger, comparing the ink to the heavy iron door directly ahead. The door possessed 3 hinges yesterday. Today, it sat flush against the masonry, a seamless slab of rusted plate. The silence of the manor pressed against his eardrums until a rhythmic thud echoed from the ceiling. Dust drifted down, coating the violet wax in fine gray powder. Elias checked his pocket watch. The brass casing bit into his palm, warm from his body heat. He needed to reach the western stairwell before the candle flickered out. If the light failed, the architecture would fold in on itself, trapping him in a pocket of stone and airless dark. He holstered the trimmers and snatched the map. His boots crunched over salt crystals scattered across the floor, the sound harsh and lonely in the shifting gut of the house. He moved toward the wall, watching for the first sign of the mortar sweating blood. The violet light didn't just illuminate the room. It seemed to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that Elias felt in his teeth. He adjusted his cuffs, hiding the patches of hardening, pale skin creeping up his wrists, and stepped into the throat of the corridor. The heavy thud from above repeated, followed by the grinding of gravel. Bill Miller had arrived. Elias emerged from the cellar, his lungs burning as they traded the thick, waxy air of the labyrinth for the sharp, pine-scented chill of the Massachusetts autumn. Bill stood by his rusted Ford F-150, unloading crates of canned goods and heavy bags of salt. The old man's hands were stained with grease and soil, and he moved with a frantic energy, never once looking at the house. He was whispering to a heavy wrench as he tucked it into his belt. "I'm so sorry, old girl," Bill muttered, his voice a dry rasp. He finally noticed Elias standing in the doorway and stopped, his eyes fixed firmly on the mud-caked toes of Elias's boots. "You're looking peaked, Elias," Bill said, his voice trembling. He reached into the truck bed and hauled out a crate of bottled water. "The folks down in Blackwood, they're talking. They call it the keeper's rot. Say the air around this hill tastes like a funeral parlor." Bill wiped his forehead, leaving a smear of dark oil across his brow. He didn't step onto the gravel of the driveway, staying on the grass as if the stones themselves were toxic. "They're scared, son. And scared people do things. They think the flame is a curse on the valley, that it's drawing the life out of the crops. You should leave. Just walk away. Let the debt rot with the wood." Elias felt the weight of the silver mirror in his pocket, a cold reminder of why he couldn't leave. He was already part of the house's ledger. Bill didn't wait for an answer. He practically threw the last bag of salt toward the porch and scrambled back into his truck. The engine roared, a plume of blue smoke coughing into the crisp air, and the tires spat gravel as he sped toward the mountain pass. Elias watched him go, the silence of the woods rushing back in to fill the void. He carried the supplies toward the pantry, his muscles aching with a new, stiff heaviness. The pantry was a narrow, hostile space, lined with metal shelves that felt like ribs. The smell of rancid lard was thick here, a sour, heavy scent that made his stomach churn. He began stacking the unlabeled tin cans, the silver cylinders reflecting his distorted, pale face. A floorboard creaked behind him. It wasn't the house shifting. It was a rhythmic, intentional weight. Elias froze, a can of peaches heavy in his hand. 3 figures stepped from the shadows of the kitchen, their faces obscured by crude masks of stitched burlap. They didn't speak. The leader lunged, a serrated knife gleaming in the dim light. Elias swung the heavy tin can, catching the attacker in the temple with a sickening crack. The man tumbled into a shelf, sending a cascade of metal crashing to the floor. The other 2 were on him instantly, the cramped space turning the fight into a desperate, messy scramble. A fist caught Elias in the jaw, sending a metallic tang of blood across his tongue. He reached out blindly, his fingers brushing against a heavy brass candlestick on the sideboard. He gripped the cold metal and swung with every ounce of his remaining strength. The blow landed on a masked shoulder, followed by a frantic shove that sent the attackers reeling back. They scrambled for the exit, their boots thumping against the hardwood as they fled into the darkening woods. Elias leaned against the pantry door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. On the floor, amidst the scattered cans, lay a small, leather-bound journal that had fallen from one of the men. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He picked up the book, the leather feeling strangely like human skin, oily and warm, subverted. Elias wiped the blood from his lip and sat on a kitchen stool, the journal heavy in his lap. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction. This was the break he needed. These cultists were local, likely the descendants of the workers who had built the manor. If they were trying to kill him, it meant they were afraid of him. It meant he had leverage. He imagined himself walking into the Blackwood Sheriff's office with this book, exposing the secret society that had been terrorizing his family for generations. He could see the headlines, the police tape, the end of the Thorne debt. He opened the first page, expecting to find names, dates, a list of conspirators he could hand over to the law. The handwriting was meticulous, a flowing script that looked hauntingly familiar. Year 142 of the harvest, the first entry began. Elias felt a small spark of hope. This wasn't just a cult. It was a record. He read on, his eyes darting across the pages. The entries described the chemical process of rendering, the exact temperatures needed to turn human remains into a stable, slow-burning fuel. It talked about the purity of the Thorne line and how the violet flame required the specific caloric density of those born of the blood. He smiled to himself, thinking of how easily this would hold up in court. This was evidence of murder, of desecration. He felt a wave of relief. He wasn't crazy. He was a victim of a documented crime. Then he saw a diagram. It was a sketch of a human arm showing the progression of a calcification process. The notes in the margin were written in a sharp, legalistic hand he recognized instantly. Subject, Elias Thorne. Phase 1 complete. Dermal hardening proceeding at expected rate. Transition to fuel state estimated for midwinter. Elias's breath hitched. He turned the page and found a copy of his own birth certificate clipped to a ledger. Above it, a signature was scrawled in bold, authoritative ink. Arthur Sterling, executor. The world tilted. This wasn't a journal belonging to the cultists. It was a management log. The cultists weren't trying to stop the flame. They were the maintenance crew. They hadn't attacked him to kill him. They had been testing his structural integrity. Elias looked at his wrists, pulling back his sleeves. The pale, waxy patches weren't a disease or a reaction to the house. They were the adipocere mentioned in the text, the rendering of his own fat while he was still alive. Sterling wasn't his lawyer. He was the butcher, and Elias was the livestock. He realized with a sickening jolt that he hadn't won the fight. He had merely proven he was still strong enough to be worth the harvest. The journal he thought was his salvation was actually his death warrant. And by taking it, he had alerted the butcher that the prey was becoming self-aware. Elias stumbled to the hallway mirror, his hands shaking so violently, the silver-plated hand mirror in his pocket clinked against his ring. Clink, 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 clink. He pulled it out and held it to his face, but he didn't look at his eyes. He looked at the skin of his neck. Under the harsh electric light of the foyer, his flesh looked like a candle left in a hot car. It was translucent, a sickly, unearthly white that seemed to glow with a faint inner light. He pressed a finger to his forearm, and the skin didn't spring back. It left a deep, doughy indentation that slowly filled with a clear, oily fluid. He was melting. The house was eating him from the inside out, turning his very biology into the fuel required by the labyrinth. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. He lunged for the heavy oak front door, throwing the deadbolts and heaving with all his weight. The door didn't budge. He ran to the window, but the view outside had vanished. A wall of white, crystalline ice pressed against the glass. A blizzard, sudden and impossible, had buried the manor in a matter of minutes. The mountain pass was gone, replaced by a howling void of snow. He raced from room to room, but every exit was the same, sealed by ice or locked by a mechanism he couldn't see. The air in the house began to change, the sharp scent of pine replaced by a suffocating floral weight. Lilies, the smell of a funeral home. It coated his tongue, thick and sweet, making every breath a struggle against a gag reflex. The heavy thud of the front knocker echoed through the foyer. Tap, 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 tap. 4 rhythmic strikes. Elias backed away, his boots skidding on the polished floor. The door, which moments ago had been an immovable wall of wood, swung open with a slow, mocking groan. Arthur Sterling stepped inside, his suit as sharp and stiff as a shroud. He carried a double-barreled shotgun across his arm, the steel barrels glinting in the violet light leaking from the basement door. Sterling didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a farmer finding a fence post knocked over. "You're making a mess of the schedule, Elias," Sterling said, his voice a calm, predatory rasp. He tapped his gold signet ring against the doorframe. Tap, 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 tap. "The debt doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares about the flame. And the flame is hungry." He raised the shotgun, the twin dark holes of the barrels pointing directly at Elias's chest. "Get back to the labyrinth. We have a quota to meet before the solstice, and you're the only Thorne left with enough marrow to settle the interest." Elias felt a surge of white-hot defiance. He wasn't a candle. He wasn't a line in a ledger. He lunged at Sterling, catching the older man by surprise. They collided at the base of the grand staircase, the shotgun discharging with a deafening roar that shattered the crystal chandelier above. Shards of glass rained down like diamond rain, slicing into the mahogany banister. They rolled across the floor, Elias clawing at Sterling's face, his fingers sliding against the man's skin, which felt unnaturally cold and hard. They scrambled onto the stairs, a brutal, clumsy struggle for the weapon. Elias managed to plant a foot in Sterling's chest and shove, but as he tried to stand, the floorboards beneath him softened. The wood turned to a viscous, honey-like sludge, catching his boot and sending him sprawling. Sterling regained his footing, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't fire the gun again. Instead, he used the butt of the weapon to strike Elias across the temple. The world exploded in a blur of violet and gray. Elias rolled, his body feeling heavy and unresponsive, and threw himself toward the second-story landing. He didn't think. He simply reacted. He crashed through the large stained-glass window, the leaded panes shattering as he plummeted into the freezing snowdrift below. The cold was a mercy. The sub-zero air hit his melting skin, and for a moment, the doughy softness of his limbs solidified. He crawled through the drifts, the wind howling like a wounded beast, his fingers numb as they dug into the ice. He looked back at the manor, its dark silhouette looming against the white void. The house seemed to pulse, a rhythmic glow emanating from the basement windows. Suddenly, a jolt of electricity shot through his spine. It wasn't physical pain, but a psychic intrusion. A cold, ancient consciousness that tasted like wet earth and old copper. "Stay," the voice whispered, not in his ears, but in his marrow. "The wick is set. The wax is ready." Elias realized with a soul-crushing horror that the first ancestor wasn't a ghost. It was a parasite, a primordial entity that had lived within the Thorne bloodline for centuries. The flame wasn't just light, it was a bridge, and that bridge was now anchored to his own nervous system. He could run to the ends of the earth, but he was carrying the labyrinth inside him. The geography of the manor was merely a physical manifestation of a biological contract. He was the house, and the house was him. He dragged himself back toward the cellar doors, driven not by a desire to return, but by a desperate final plan. If he was the fuel, he would make himself a bomb. He remembered the attic, the one place Sterling never went. Years ago, his father had mentioned a cache of renovation supplies that were too dangerous to keep in the shed. Elias broke the lock on the attic door, his breath coming in white plumes. The air here smelled of ozone and gunpowder. Amidst the sterile, dust-free crates, he found what he was looking for. Boxes of high-grade industrial dynamite left behind by a Thorne who had clearly reached the same conclusion he had. He began the grueling process of hauling the crates down the stairs. His legs were becoming soft again, the heat of the house returning his flesh to a semi-liquid state. Each step was an agony of shifting weight, the floorboards groaning and sweating a foul-smelling grease as he passed. The house was fighting him now, the corridors lengthening, the doors shrinking. The walls seemed to breathe, the wallpaper rippling like skin. He reached the entrance to the labyrinth, the violet light now a blinding, throbbing sun. Subverted. Elias stood at the threshold of the basement, the detonator in his hand. He felt a grim sense of triumph. Sterling wanted a harvest. He would give him a holocaust. He imagined the explosion ripping through the limestone foundations, collapsing the manor into the earth, and snuffing out the violet flame forever. He would die, yes, but the entity would die with him. The Thorne debt would be settled in fire and rubble. He felt a strange peace. This was the logical conclusion. The architect destroying the flawed structure to save the site. He began setting the charges around the central pedestal, his fingers moving with practiced precision. He wired the caps, checked the continuity, and prepared the timer. He was smart. He was efficient. He was the one in control now. He looked at the violet flame, which seemed to flicker in a way that looked almost like fear. He had won. "A bold plan, Elias," a voice remarked from the shadows. Sterling stepped into the violet light, but he made no move to stop him. He wasn't even holding the shotgun. He looked almost amused. "The cleansing fire approach. Your grandfather tried it in 42. Your great-uncle in 68. It's a classic Thorne reaction to stress," Elias sneered, his thumb hovering over the timer. "It ends tonight, Sterling. I'm blowing this nightmare to hell." Sterling stepped closer, the violet light reflecting off his unblinking eyes. "Do you know what happens when you compress a gas, Elias? Or when you provide a massive surge of thermal energy to a dormant organism? The first ancestor doesn't live in the flame. The flame is its cage. It's a low-energy barrier that keeps its consciousness localized to this valley." Sterling gestured to the dynamite. "You're not building a tomb. You're building a catapult. That explosion won't snuff the light. It will provide the exact kinetic energy the entity needs to bridge the gap between this world and the next. It's been waiting for a host with the architectural mind to provide the necessary structural catalyst." The color drained from Elias's already pale face. He looked at the dynamite, then at the flame. The entity didn't want him to keep the fire burning. It wanted him to blow it up. The cultists, the threats, the harvest. It was all theater designed to push him to this exact moment of desperate destruction. He had played his role perfectly. He wasn't the hero. He was the trigger. The smart move was the very thing that would doom the world. He tried to pull his hand away from the detonator, but his skin had already begun to fuse with the plastic casing. The melt had accelerated, his nervous system now physically entwined with the machine. He watched in a trance of horror as his own liquefied skin began to flow toward the violet flame, drawn by a magnetic pull. The heat didn't burn. It invited. The first ancestor reached out through the glare, 1,000 invisible threads of consciousness dipping into Elias's mind. He saw the history of the Thorne line, not as a family, but as a series of batteries, each one used to charge the entity for its eventual release. Sterling stood by, mocking him with a silent, rhythmic tap of his ring. Tap, 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 tap. The ticking of the detonator's clock echoed against the pulsating, organic walls of the chamber. Elias was paralyzed. He was caught in the center of the labyrinth, his body a bridge of melting wax, his hand a permanent part of the bomb. The god of rot began to emerge from the light, a shape that was neither solid nor liquid, a shifting mass of ancestral memories and primordial hunger. The ticking reached its final 10 seconds. In that final moment of clarity, Elias didn't think as a victim. He thought as an architect. He didn't look at the flame. He looked at the ceiling. The labyrinth wasn't just a basement. It was a vaulted chamber designed to distribute weight. He saw the stress points, the keystone that held the millions of tons of granite manor above their heads. He didn't need to destroy the entity with fire. He needed to bury it with weight. With a final, agonizing effort, he shifted his fused hand. He didn't cancel the timer. He redirected the charges. He used his last bit of human strength to kick a crate of dynamite toward the main support pillar. The explosion wouldn't be a surge. It would be a collapse. The sound was a world-ending roar, not the sharp crack of a bomb, but the deep, tectonic groan of a mountain falling. The ceiling buckled. The violet light was swallowed by a tidal wave of gray stone. Elias felt the psychic weight of the house vanish as the entity was crushed under the sheer mass of the earth. Sterling's image flickered and dissolved into a cloud of soot. He had never been human at all, just a projection of the entity's will to keep the harvest on track. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Elias lay in the dark, pinned beneath a slab of limestone. He couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't feel the cold. He could only feel the stillness. He had broken the cycle. He had used the thorn greed to build a tomb that would never be opened. He closed his eyes, the waxy skin of his face finally setting into a permanent, peaceful mask. Years later, the mountain pass cleared. A young woman named Sarah Johnson pulled her car up to the ruins of Thorne Manor. She held a letter in her hand, a notice of a significant Massachusetts inheritance. She looked at the blackened stones, the way the forest seemed to recoil from the sight. She felt a strange pull toward the cellar, a curiosity she couldn't explain. She descended into the remains of the sub-basement, her flashlight cutting through the damp dark. In the center of the collapsed vault, she saw it. A statue of a man, carved from what looked like translucent, violet-veined wax. He sat on a throne of granite, his hand resting on a rusted metal box. As her light hit his face, the statue's eyes seemed to catch the glare. Elias Thorne, the eternal guardian, watched her with silent intensity. He was no longer a man, but he was no longer fuel. He was the seal. And as Sarah reached out to touch the cold, waxy surface of his hand, he felt a flicker of the old debt stir in the dark. The legacy of the Thorne line was a long one, and even in the silence of the stone, the flame was waiting for someone new to keep it fed.